The night Louisa Aldridge crawled through a gap in the barn wall with nothing but a carpetbag, a bruised cheekbone, and the desperate prayer that no one would find her until morning. She had no idea she was climbing into the hayloft of the most stubborn, decent man in all of Cutter's Creek, Wyoming territory. It was the autumn of 1878, and the world outside was cold enough to crack a person straight down to the bone. The wind rolled down from the mountains like something alive and angry, and it bent the tall grass flat against the earth the way a man bends under a burden he has carried too long. The stars were out, sharp and merciless, throwing just enough light to see by without offering any warmth whatsoever. The town of Cutter's Creek sat on the edge of the Wyoming high plains like a sentence someone had started but never quite finished. There was a general store, a telegraph office, a church that needed a new roof, a saloon that needed a new anything, and about 40 souls scratching out whatever kind of living the land was willing to spare them. Louisa had arrived in Cutter's Creek 3 weeks prior on the southbound stage from Cheyenne. She had come with her father, Douglas Aldridge, who had taken a position overseeing a small cattle operation owned by a man named Gerald Whitmore. Gerald Whitmore was the kind of man who dressed well and spoke with careful words, and whose eyes, if you looked closely enough, had something cold living behind them that no amount of fine clothing could cover. Louisa had noticed it the first night at supper when he watched her across the table with an expression she did not have a clean name for. But her father had noticed nothing, or perhaps had noticed and decided it did not matter, because Douglas Aldridge had debts that ran deep and options that ran shallow, and Gerald Whitmore paid good money. The trouble had begun not quite 2 weeks into their stay at Whitmore's ranch house. Her father had ridden out with the hands to check the northern fence line, and Whitmore had come to find Louisa in the kitchen garden. He had spoken plainly about what he wanted, and Louisa had refused him just as plainly. He had not liked that. He had grabbed her wrist so hard she could feel the bones grinding together, and she had twisted away and told him if he touched her again, she would put a cast iron skillet across his skull. He had laughed at that, low and unpleasant, and told her she had a week to reconsider before he made her father's debts the center of a very unpleasant conversation. She had gone to her father that same evening. Douglas Aldridge had listened to her with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the floor, and when she was finished he had said, very quietly, that Whitmore was a powerful man in this territory, and that she should think carefully about what kind of life she was refusing. Louisa had stared at her father for a long moment and felt something shift inside her. Some last remaining trust that had been holding on by its fingernails finally let go and fell. She had not cried. She had gone to her room and spent 3 days thinking clearly and carefully while she waited for the right moment to leave. That moment had come tonight when Whitmore rode out to settle a dispute at the south pasture, and her father drank himself into a heavy sleep in the parlor chair. Louisa had packed what she could fit in her carpetbag, taken the $7.40 she had sewn into the lining of her second petticoat when she left Cheyenne, and walked out into the Wyoming night without a single backward glance. The problem was that Whitmore's ranch sat 4 miles east of Cutter's Creek, and it was nearly midnight, and the temperature was dropping with every step she took. She had made it into town well enough, moving quickly along the road, and then cutting across the open ground behind the livery stable. But the stage north did not run until 8 in the morning, and the only hotel in town was owned by a man named Preacher Dunn who was, as it happened, one of Gerald Whitmore's closest friends. She could not go there. She could not go to the saloon. She could not simply stand in the street for 8 hours in the cold without someone seeing her and word reaching Whitmore before dawn. And so she had seen the large, dark shape of a barn set back behind a homestead at the north edge of town, seen the gap between 2 boards near the base of the wall, and made a decision that felt, in the moment, entirely reasonable. The hayloft was warm in the way that only a well-built barn with good animals in it could be. The heat rose up from the horses and the 2 milk cows below, and the hay itself held the day's last warmth like a closed fist. Louisa climbed the rough wooden ladder and found a corner near the back wall where the hay was piled deep and soft, and she burrowed into it and pulled her coat tighter and told herself she only needed to stay awake until the light came up enough to see the road clearly. She could be at the stage office by 7:30. She could be on the coach north before anyone who mattered noticed she was gone. She was asleep within 10 minutes. She slept hard and dreamlessly the way that only genuine exhaustion can make a person sleep, and she did not hear the barn door open below, and she did not hear the boots on the earthen floor, and she most certainly did not hear the wooden rungs of the ladder creaking under a man's weight until the man himself was already halfway up, and his lantern light was spilling across the loft in golden, swaying arcs. Aaron Kendrick had been out later than he intended. He had ridden to the baler spread to return a borrowed post driver, and stayed longer than planned because old Elia's baler had opened a bottle of good whiskey and had things he needed to say about his late wife, and Aaron was not the kind of man who left when someone needed to talk. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and brown eyes that had what people in town described as a serious look, though those who knew him well understood it was less severity than it was careful attention. He had owned this homestead for 4 years, built the barn himself with help from his neighbor Cal Prout, and ran a small herd of cattle plus a modest string of horses that he sold to the Army Remount Depot at Fort Laramie twice a year. He was not a rich man, but he was a solvent one, which in 1878 Wyoming put him comfortably ahead of most. He lifted his lantern above the level of the loft floor and stopped moving. There was a woman asleep in his hay. He stood very still for a moment, taking in the details the way a man takes in something unexpected on the range, looking for what it means before he decides what to do about it. She was young, probably mid-20s, with dark auburn hair that had come mostly loose from its pins and spread across the hay in a way that looked almost artistic, though he doubted she had arranged it that way on purpose. She was wearing a traveling coat that had seen better days and was holding a carpetbag against her chest like a child holds a stuffed toy. Her boots were worn at the heels. There was a bruise along her left cheekbone that the lantern light caught in a way that made something tighten hard in Aaron's chest. He could have woken her immediately. He could have been sharp about it, said she had no business in his barn, sent her back out into the cold night. Most men would have. But Aaron Kendrick looked at that bruise and at the white-knuckled grip she had on that carpetbag even in her sleep, and he came the rest of the way up the ladder and set the lantern down on a post hook, far enough that it would not disturb her, and he went back down and settled himself in the chair he kept by the tack room and waited. He waited for over an hour before she stirred. Louisa came awake slowly, then all at once, in that terrifying way of someone who remembers where they are mid-breath. She sat straight up and her hand went immediately to the carpet bag, and she looked down from the loft edge and found a man sitting in a wooden chair below, his long legs crossed at the ankle, reading a dog-eared almanac by lantern light as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Good morning," Aaron said, without looking up from the almanac. "Though I suppose technically it is still night. About 2 in the morning, I would guess." Louisa looked at him. She looked at the door. She calculated the distance. "I am not going to stop you," Aaron said, still not looking up. "If you want to leave, the door is right there. But it is 22 degrees out and falling, and there is not much between here and the stage office except cold ground and dark road." "How do you know I am waiting for the stage?" Louisa asked. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I do not know," Aaron said. "But someone sleeping in a stranger's barn at midnight is usually either passing through or in some kind of trouble, and since you came in light, without a horse, I am guessing it is both." He closed the almanac and looked up at her then for the first time, and there was nothing in his face but plain, direct consideration. Not threat, not amusement at her expense, just a man taking stock of a situation. "My name is Aaron Kendrick," he said. "This is my barn. You are welcome to stay in it until morning if that is what you need. There is a blanket on the peg by the left stall if the hay is not enough. I will be in the house." He stood, taking his lantern. "Wait," Louisa said. He waited. "You are not going to ask questions." "I have got a few," Aaron said, "but none of them require answers at 2 in the morning." She watched him walk to the barn door, and something about the straightness of his back, the unhurried way he moved, made her say, "Louisa, my name is Louisa Aldridge." He paused at the door and turned just enough to look back over his shoulder. "Miss Aldridge," he said, with a small nod that was almost a bow. "Sleep well." And he went out, and Louisa sat in the hay with the carpetbag on her knees and the warm animal smell of the barn all around her, and she felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, like she might actually be all right. She did not sleep again, not deeply. She lay in the hay and watched the gaps in the barn wall lighten from black to gray to the pale silver that meant dawn was building somewhere behind the mountains. She thought about the stage. She thought about Cheyenne and whether she had anyone there worth going back to. She had a cousin in Denver who might take her in for a time. She had $7.40. She had a bruise on her face and a father who had looked at the floor instead of her eyes, and she thought, not for the first time, that a person could carry grief and anger at the same time, and that the two did not cancel each other out, but instead sat side by side and made everything heavier. When the light had come up enough to make out the yard clearly through the barn's small east-facing window, she heard the house door and then boots on the hard ground. And Aaron Kendrick came back into the barn carrying a tin cup of coffee in each hand, and moving with the careful balance of a man who has done this before. "If you want it," he said, holding one cup up toward the loft, "I can put it on the post here." "I will come down," Louisa said. She climbed the ladder and took the cup he offered and wrapped both hands around it and let the warmth soak into her palms. They stood in the barn in the growing gray morning light, and for a minute neither of them spoke, and the silence was not uncomfortable. The horses shifted in their stalls. One of the cows made a low sound. "That bruise," Aaron said at last, looking at her cheekbone. "Who did that?" "A man who thought he had the right to," Louisa said. Aaron's jaw set in a way that was quiet but definite. "Does that man know where you are?" "No. But he will figure it out when he finds me gone. He is not a stupid man." She looked at Aaron over the rim of the cup. "Gerald Whitmore, do you know him?" Something moved through Aaron's expression, brief and controlled. "I know of him," he said. "He owns the cattle operation east of town." "My father works for him," Louisa said. "Or did. I expect that arrangement will change once Whitmore discovers I have left." "Your father," Aaron said. "Is he going to come looking for you?" Louisa took a long sip of coffee. "I do not think so," she said, and the flatness in her voice made it clear she had already worked through whatever feelings that required working through. "My father made his choices. I made mine." Aaron nodded slowly. He turned to check on the nearest horse, running a hand along its neck in a habitual, comfortable way. "Where are you headed?" "Denver. I have a cousin there. If I can get north to Cheyenne today on the stage, I can catch the southbound coach in 2 days." "The stage does not run today," Aaron said. He turned back and met her eyes directly. "It runs Tuesdays and Fridays. Today is Wednesday." Louisa felt the information land like something dropped from a height. She stared at him. "I was certain it ran on Wednesdays. They changed the schedule 2 months back. Tom Garvey lost a wheel on the Tuesday run and decided the schedule needed adjusting." Aaron said it without any satisfaction, just plain fact delivery. "Next northbound stage is Friday morning at 8, 2 days." Louisa set the tin cup on a post and thought through the arithmetic. She had enough money to feed herself for 2 days barely. She could not stay at the hotel. She could not stay at the saloon. She had exactly nowhere to go. "You can stay here," Aaron said. She looked at him. "I'm not saying it lightly," he said. "I have got a spare room in the house, used to be my mother's. There is a lock on the door, and the key is on the inside. You would have complete privacy, and I would conduct myself as a gentleman, which I realize is easy for any man to claim, but which I can support by the testimony of several people in this town if you find yourself needing references." He said the last part with such earnest seriousness that Louisa felt the strange, inconvenient urge to smile. "It is not charity," he continued. "There is fence work I have been putting off, and my hands have been gone 4 days helping Prout with his roundup. If you can handle a meal or two while you are here, I would call us even." "You are offering me a room in exchange for cooking," Louisa said. "I am offering you a room because you need one," Aaron said, "and mentioning the cooking so you do not feel like you owe me something you did not agree to. There is a difference." Louisa studied him. He stood in his own barn in the early morning light, entirely at ease, making a reasonable offer with no conditions she could find fault with and no undercurrent she could detect. She had spent 3 weeks learning to read the undercurrents in men's voices. This one had none. "All right," she said. 2 days. "And I will cook." Aaron nodded like she had confirmed something practical. "Breakfast first, then. The chickens have been laying well." The house was not large, but it was solid. Aaron had built it himself, too. She would learn, over the course of that first year on the land, piecing it up board by board in the brief hours between the work that a ranch demanded. It had 2 rooms downstairs, a combined kitchen and living space, and a small study where a tall bookshelf stood against one wall with more books than Louisa had expected. It had 2 rooms upstairs, his and the spare. The spare room was clean and simply furnished, a narrow bed with a good quilt, a washstand with a ceramic basin, a small window that looked out over the back pasture where the pale autumn grass stretched all the way to the foothills. She stood at that window while Aaron brought in water for the washstand, and she looked at the mountains going blue and gold in the morning light and thought that under different circumstances this would be a beautiful place to be. "I will be in the barn if you need anything," Aaron said at the doorway. "There is food in the kitchen. Help yourself to what you find." "Mr. Kendrick," she said. He paused. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that plainly." "I know you do," he said, and left her to it. She washed her face and changed her blouse and went downstairs and built a fire in the kitchen stove and found his provisions, which were functional if uninspired. She scrambled eggs with dried onion and sliced the heel of a bread loaf and heated the remaining coffee, and when Aaron came in from the barn an hour later she had a proper breakfast on the table. He looked at it with an expression she could not quite read, something between surprise and something quieter. "I have been eating out of a pan for about 3 weeks," he said, sitting down. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle, had to go back to her sister's place in Laramie." "Is that an explanation or an apology?" Louisa asked, sitting across from him. "Neither," Aaron said. "Just context." He looked at her across the table with those serious, attentive eyes. "How is your cheek?" "Sore," she said honestly. "Not serious." "Whitmore," he said, and it came out like a statement that contained a great deal more than just a name. "I refused him," Louisa said. "He did not take it well." Aaron ate in silence for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, a pair of sparrows argued on the porch rail. "Whitmore has a reputation," he said carefully. "I did not know he had gone as far as putting his hands on a woman." "Perhaps not many women have said no to him before," Louisa said. "That is probably true," Aaron said. "Men like that, the ones with money and influence out here, they rarely hear the word no. And when they do not know what to do with it." Louisa looked at him. "You said his name like you have a history with him." Aaron was quiet for a beat too long. "His cattle operation runs up against my north fence line," he said. "We have had some disagreements about where his cattle graze and where mine do. Nothing that has come to blows, but nothing friendly either." "He is the kind of man who makes everything about power," Louisa said. "Yes," Aaron said. "He is exactly that kind of man." They finished breakfast, and Louisa washed the dishes and Aaron went back out to the fence work he had mentioned, and the day settled into a strange, quiet domesticity that neither of them quite commented on. Aaron worked from just after sunrise until the light began to change in the afternoon, coming in once at midday for the beans and salt pork Louisa had simmering on the stove. He ate at the table and they talked, not about anything consequential at first, but about the kind of things 2 people discuss when they are learning the shape of each other's minds. He told her about the land, about the 4 years of building this homestead from raw ground. She told him she had been a schoolteacher in Cheyenne before her father's financial troubles had pulled her out here. He asked her about teaching with a genuine curiosity that surprised her, asking not just what she taught but how, whether she thought the children in the frontier towns learned differently than children in more settled places. She said she thought they did. She said they learned with a kind of urgency that children in more settled places sometimes lacked, because they understood, in the way that children absorb the truth of their surroundings, that knowledge was one of the few things out here that could not be taken away by drought or debt or bad luck. Aaron had looked at her across the table with an expression she could not name yet, something attentive and warm and also slightly wondering. "That is a good way to put it," he said. In the afternoon he asked, without preamble, if she knew how to ride. When she said yes, he offered her the use of his quieter mare, a compact gray named Pearl, and she rode out with him to check the south pasture where 3 posts had worked loose from the freeze and thaw cycles of the previous winter. He dug and she handed and braced, and they worked together with an ease that struck her as remarkable given that they had known each other for exactly 1 morning. The land spread out around them in that huge, indifferent Wyoming way, and the sky was so tall and blue it almost made a sound, and Louisa thought that despite everything, despite the bruise on her face and the father who had failed her and the man she was running from, she was more fully present in her own body right now than she had been in weeks. "You are good with a post," Aaron said, tamping the last one down. "I grew up in a small town outside of Abilene," Louisa said, "before my father moved us north. We had a small place. I know what work looks like." "Abilene," Aaron said. "That was still rough country in the late 60s. "It was," she said. "My mother used to say the grass out there was tough enough to argue with." She paused. "She died when I was 15, fever." "I am sorry," Aaron said, and he said it simply, the way people say it when they mean it rather than when they are simply filling silence. "Your mother," Louisa said. "The room upstairs, you said it was hers." "She came out to live with me the 2nd year," Aaron said, leaning on the post driver. "She was from Ohio, was not built for this climate, though she would have argued that point to her last breath. She lasted 2 winters before her lungs gave out." He looked out at the mountains. "She liked it here, though. She used to sit in that window in the mornings with her coffee and say it was worth the cold just to see the light on those peaks." "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Louisa said. "She was the best person I ever knew," Aaron said, without any sentimentality and all the more meaningful for it. They rode back in the dying light of the afternoon, and Louisa cooked a proper supper, salt pork and fried potatoes and a dried apple cake she found the ingredients for in the back of his pantry. Aaron came to the table with his hair damp from washing at the pump and looked at the cake with an expression of genuine disbelief. "Where did you find the dried apples?" he asked. "Tin on the back shelf behind the flour. They were still good." "I forgot I had those," he said. "Cal Prute's wife sent those over in the spring." "Then you should thank her next time you see her," Louisa said, sitting down, "and perhaps pay closer attention to what is in your own pantry." Aaron looked at her, and there it was again, that expression she could not quite name but was beginning to recognize, something steady and amused and also entirely serious. "I expect you are right," he said. They talked longer after supper that night. The fire burned low in the hearth and neither of them moved to let it go out, and they talked about books, which turned out to be dangerous territory because they both had strong opinions. He favored history and natural science. She had been raised on Dickens and had opinions about it. He said Dickens was sentimental. She said sentiment was not the same as weakness, and perhaps he would know the difference if he read more carefully. He looked at her the way a man looks when he has been challenged by someone who is right, which is to say he looked both unsettled and interested, and he pulled a copy of Bleak House from his shelf and said he was willing to be convinced. "You have read it already," she said. "About half of it," he admitted. "I set it down about 3 years ago." "Why?" "It made me feel things I did not know how to deal with at the time," he said. And then, apparently surprised by his own honesty, he looked at the fire. "That is probably more than you needed to know about my reading habits." "I think it is exactly enough," Louisa said. She went to bed that night with the key turned in the lock, not because she was afraid, but because she had promised herself she would be careful with herself from here on out. She lay in the dark under the good quilt and listened to the wind in the eaves and the distant sound of coyotes somewhere out on the plain, and she thought about Friday morning and the stage coach in Denver and her cousin Margaret, who had married a dry goods merchant and had a house with a parlor. It was a reasonable plan. It was a sensible plan. It was the plan she had made in a dark moment with a bruised cheek and a carpetbag, and in the quiet of this solid little room under the Wyoming sky it felt both necessary and, strangely, like something that cost her something she could not name. She slept, and this time she dreamed. The second day came in bright and cold, and Aaron was already in the barn when Louisa came downstairs, but he had left a clean pot on the stove and a fresh-cut pile of kindling beside it, and there was something quietly thoughtful about that which she noted but did not make too much of. She built the fire and made coffee, and when he came in from the morning chores she handed him a cup without ceremony, and he accepted it the same way. It was during breakfast that trouble arrived. The knock on the door was loud and came without warning, 3 hard raps that carried a kind of authority. Aaron's expression went still in a very controlled way. He stood and went to the door. Gerald Whitmore stood on the porch with 2 of his ranch hands at his back. He was a tall man, perhaps 50, with the kind of physical presence that came not from the land but from money, the expensive coat, the clean hat, the boots that had never dug a post hole. His eyes, as Louisa had noted 3 weeks ago at supper, were cold even when his mouth was arranged into something resembling pleasantness. "Kendrick," he said with a nod. "I am looking for a young woman, Louisa Aldridge's daughter. She has gone missing and her father is beside himself with worry." Aaron leaned one hand on the door frame. "I would not know anything about that," he said. His voice was pleasant and entirely unreadable. "I thought perhaps she might have passed through this way, spoken to someone." "Have not seen her," Aaron said. Whitmore's eyes moved past Aaron's shoulder into the kitchen, and Louisa, who had risen from the table the moment she heard that voice, had moved to stand flat against the interior wall beside the door, out of the sightline. Her heart was moving at a considerable pace. "You would not mind if we took a look around," Whitmore said, and it was not really a question. "I would mind, actually," Aaron said. His tone did not change, still pleasant, still even, with something underneath it that was not quite sharp but was close to it. "A man's land is his land, Whitmore. You know that better than most." A silence. Then Whitmore said with a slight shift in his voice that removed the pleasantness, "That girl is under age of independent legal majority by some measures, Kendrick. Her father has authority over her person." "She is 24 years old," Aaron said, "which you know, and which makes that a strange thing to say." Another silence, longer. Louisa pressed herself to the wall and breathed carefully. "If you see her," Whitmore said, "you would do well to remember who has influence in this territory." "I remember it every time I look at my north fence line," Aaron said. "Anything else I can do for you this morning?" Whitmore looked at him for 3 seconds longer than was comfortable. Then he turned and his boots went back down the porch steps and she heard horses shifting and then the sound of riders moving away. She waited until the sound was fully gone before she stepped away from the wall. Aaron closed the door and turned. Their eyes met. "He will be back," Louisa said. "Probably," Aaron said. He went to the window and watched the riders until they cleared the tree line, then turned back. "He does not know you are here. If he did, he would have pushed harder." He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Your father told him you might have run north." "My father," Louisa said, and there was iron in her voice now, "does not deserve the worry Whitmore is claiming he has." Aaron sat back down at the table. He set both hands flat on the wood surface and looked at her. "I need to ask you something and I need you to answer me honestly." "All right," she said. "Are you in any legal trouble? Did you take anything from Whitmore or your father that would give him a legal claim on you or your possessions?" "No," she said firmly. "I took my own clothes and my own money. 37 cents of my own earning and $7 I saved from my teaching wages before I came out here." Aaron nodded. Then legally, you are a free woman walking. He has no claim, he paused. But legally and practically are different things out here, you know that. I know it very well, Louisa said. He looked at her for a long moment and then he said something that seemed to surprise even himself. Stay. The word came out quiet and direct and it sat in the kitchen like something that had been placed there carefully. You mean until Friday, Louisa said. I mean longer than that, Aaron said. He was looking at the table rather than at her now, which was unusual for a man who tended toward directness, and she thought it meant he was choosing words with more care than usual. I mean this is a homestead that has been running short-handed for a year and a half. I mean there is a room with a lock that would stay locked for as long as you needed it. I mean I am not the kind of man Whitmore is, and I know I am asking you to take that on faith, which is not easy after what has happened, but I am asking anyway. He looked up then. You said you were a teacher. There is talk in town about organizing a proper school come spring. The children are learning from whoever has time and willingness, which is not consistent or enough. You are offering me a teaching position, Louisa said slowly. I am offering you a life, Aaron said, and then caught himself slightly, a brief tightening around his eyes. Not in any inappropriate sense. A situation, employment, a place where Whitmore cannot reach you because you are established here and not some woman passing through with nowhere to claim. But you said longer, Louisa said. She held his gaze because she needed to understand exactly what he was saying. Longer than a situation. Aaron's jaw set and then released. I have been on this land 4 years, he said. I built this house with the intention of filling it someday. I have not been in a position to think about that for a long time because the ranch has taken everything, but last night, sitting across from someone who talks about books the way you do, who works a fence post with that much competence, and who made a dried apple cake out of something I forgot I owned, I found myself thinking about it. He stopped. He looked at her steadily. I am not asking you to make a decision about that today. I am asking you to stay long enough to decide whether you want to. Louisa looked at him across the kitchen table in the morning light, this man who had found her in his hayloft and brought her coffee and stood between her and Gerald Whitmore's money and reputation without a moment's hesitation or a single condition. She thought about Denver and her cousin Margaret's parlor. She thought about what a plan made in desperation looked like when the desperation was no longer quite so urgent. She thought about the mountains through the upstairs window and the mountains through this window and how they were the same mountains and they were beautiful. I will stay until Friday, she said, and then I will decide. He nodded and something in his face settled. That is fair, he said, but Friday had a way in this story of not arriving without incident. That afternoon Aaron rode into Cutter's Creek for supplies, and Louisa stayed to tend the stove and the animals. And while he was gone, she explored the house with the particular attention of someone who is assessing not just a space, but the person it reflects. The bookshelf in the study was more organized than his pantry, which told her something. The bedroom door he had left open when he went out was spare and clean, a bed made with military neatness, a photograph on the small dresser of a woman who must have been his mother, round-faced and composed-looking, with the same careful, attending eyes. There was a letter on the desk, half-written, addressed to someone named James at an address in Ohio, and she did not read it, but the handwriting was even and deliberate, which was consistent. She went out to feed the horses at midday, and she was carrying the water bucket across the yard when the second visitor arrived. This one she did not know. He came alone, riding a buckskin horse, and he was older, perhaps 60, with a weathered face and a deputy's badge that had seen considerable use pinned to his coat. He pulled up a polite distance from where she stood and touched his hat brim. "Afternoon, ma'am. I am Deputy Arlo Taft. I am looking for Aaron Kendrick." "He is in town," Louisa said, keeping her voice even. "I expect him back within the hour." The deputy took her in with the unhurried assessment of a man who has spent decades reading situations quickly. "You would be Douglas Aldridge's daughter," he said. "Not a question." "I would be Louisa Aldridge," she said. "Yes." Taft was quiet for a moment and she braced herself. But what he said was, "I want you to know that Gerald Whitmore has been to see me this morning. He asked me to assist in retrieving you." He paused. "I want you to also know that I asked him what legal basis he had for such a retrieval, and he did not have a satisfactory answer. You are a grown woman with no legal obligation to be anywhere you do not choose to be, and I told him that plainly." Louisa felt the tightness in her chest ease slightly. And he accepted that. "Whitmore does not accept things," Taft said with a dry evenness. "He redirects them. I expect he will try another avenue, but I wanted you to know where I stand." He looked at the house and then back at her. "You are staying with Kendrick." "As his guest," Louisa said. "Kendrick is a good man," Taft said simply. "Best I know of in this valley, and I have known most of them for 20 years. He touched his hat brim again. "I will tell him what I told you when I see him. Good afternoon, Miss Aldridge." He rode away, and Louisa carried the water bucket to the trough and stood there for a moment with her hand on the rough wooden edge of it, thinking about what it meant to have an ally she had not expected. Aaron came back from town with flour and sugar and a paper-wrapped packet he set on the kitchen table and pushed toward her. She opened it, writing paper. A good quality ink pen in a small cardboard box. "In case you want to write to your cousin in Denver," he said, entirely matter of fact. "Tell her you are safe, so she does not worry." Louisa stared at the writing paper for a long beat. "How did you know I would have someone to write to?" "Because a woman with your kind of competence and independence does not arrive in the world without having built connections," Aaron said, hanging his coat on the peg. "And a woman going to Denver on her own goes to someone, not just somewhere." She looked up at him. "You are very observant." "I am a careful listener," he said, "which people sometimes mistake for something more impressive." She laughed. It came out sudden and genuine, the kind of laugh that surprises you. Aaron looked at her with that expression again, the one she was beginning to understand now, the one that was warm and wondering, and he looked away first. Deputy Taft arrived just before supper, and the three of them sat at the kitchen table while Taft told Aaron what he had told Louisa about Whitmore, and a few things more. Whitmore had, apparently, gone directly from Taft's office to the telegraph office and sent a wire somewhere, destination unknown. He had also had a long conversation with Preacher Dunn, who owned the hotel, and with the owner of the general store, a man named Harlow, who controlled credit for most of the town's residents. "He is applying pressure," Aaron said. He was leaning back in his chair with his coffee cup and his face was very calm, which Louisa was beginning to understand was what serious calculation looked like on him. Not legal pressure, because he does not have legal standing. Social and financial pressure. "That is my read," Taft said. "He can pressure my credit," Aaron said. "I do not owe Harlow much, but it would complicate matters." He was thinking aloud, not asking for reassurance. "He cannot do much beyond that legally. My land is clear title, no debt to anyone with ties to Whitmore." "There is one thing," Taft said carefully. He mentioned in an offhand way something about a land survey. Said he had reason to believe the original survey of your north pasture was imprecise. The muscle in Aaron's jaw moved once. "That is creative," he said. "It is," Taft agreed. "It is also the kind of thing that takes months to move through the Territorial Land Office, and that time is on your side, not his." He finished his coffee and stood. "I just want you both aware. Whitmore is a man who prefers to win quietly. Loud wins draw attention, and attention is not what a man in his position wants." After Taft left, Aaron and Louisa sat by the fire, and this time the silence had more weight to it. The situation had shifted from uncomfortable to something with edges. "This is my problem," Louisa said at last. "What he is doing, the credit pressure and the land survey claim, those are because of me, because you sheltered me." "They are because Whitmore cannot stand to be refused," Aaron said. "Do not take responsibility for what he does." "I am not taking responsibility. I am acknowledging the cause and effect." "Then acknowledge it and set it down," Aaron said. He looked at her steadily. "I have not sheltered you because I wanted a fight with Whitmore. I sheltered you because it was right. The consequences of right action are not something to be ashamed of." Louisa looked at him for a long moment, this man in his sturdy house with his serious eyes and his books and his dead mother in the photograph and his willingness to say the true thing without decoration. "When did you know," she said, "that you wanted me to stay, not just as a guest?" Aaron looked at the fire, then at her. "Breakfast," he said. "The first breakfast. Yes. That was approximately 4 hours after you found me in your hay," Louisa said. "I am aware," Aaron said with a slight self-deprecating tilt to his expression. "I recognize it is not a long deliberation period." "I am not criticizing it," Louisa said. She was quiet for a moment. "I thought about it last night, about what you offered, about Denver. And Denver feels like leaving because I have to," she said slowly. "Not because I want to." She looked at him. "I have been running to something my whole adult life. Better situation, better placement, away from trouble and toward some imagined stability. I am tired of the word toward. I would like to arrive somewhere." "This is somewhere," Aaron said quietly. "I know it is," she said. And then, because she was a direct woman and it had served her better than any other quality she possessed, she said, "But you should know I am not easy. I have opinions about everything and I will tell you what I think and I will not apologize for being correct when I am correct, which is more often than some men are comfortable with." "I noticed that about the Dickens conversation," Aaron said, and his mouth did something that was almost a full smile. "And I will need real work," she continued. "Not just keeping your house. The school. If there is going to be a school, I want to build it properly. I want it funded and equipped and I want the children to have books." "I will fund it," Aaron said, "to the extent I am able. And if Whitmore makes trouble," she said, "then we deal with it together," he said. "That is what together means." Louisa looked at him. She thought about the hayloft and the tin cup of coffee and the way he had stood between her and Whitmore without making it about himself. She thought about the writing paper, bought in town without being asked, because he had listened carefully enough to know she would need it. She thought about the mountains through the window. "All right," she said. "I will stay." Aaron exhaled, and in that exhale was an enormous amount of something he had been holding very carefully. "There is one more thing," he said. He shifted in his chair and the firelight caught the serious line of his face and he looked simultaneously very certain and very young. "I said I would not rush you and I mean that, but I want to say it plainly because I think you deserve plain speech." He paused. "I am not asking you to stay just as a guest, or just as a teacher, or just as someone solving a practical problem of mine. When I imagine this house with you in it a year from now, it is as my wife." Louisa's breath came in slowly and went out slowly. "You are proposing to me," she said. "I am stating an intention and inviting a future conversation," Aaron said. "I understand that 2 days of acquaintance is not a sufficient basis for a woman to accept a marriage proposal, and I am not asking you to accept anything tonight. I am asking you to know where I stand so that, while you are deciding whether to stay, you are deciding with full information." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the grass and the fire popped, and one of the horses shifted in the barn. "That is the most sensibly worded declaration of romantic intent I have ever encountered," she said. "I am a sensible man," Aaron said. "Mostly." "Mostly," she repeated, and the warmth in her voice was unmistakable. She did not accept that night, but she stayed. And staying, as they both already knew in some place below deliberate thought, was already a kind of answer. The weeks that followed were the most purposeful that Louisa Aldridge had spent in years. Aaron's ranch absorbed her energy in the mornings, cooking and mending, and the endless small maintenance that a working property required. But afternoons she rode into Cutter's Creek and began, quietly and persistently, to do the work of making a school. She started with what existed. There was no schoolhouse, but there were 14 children in and around Cutter's Creek between the ages of 5 and 14 who received no formal education beyond what their parents managed at home, which varied enormously. She spoke to mothers first, because it was the mothers in Cutter's Creek who held the practical opinions about the community's future. She spoke to the wives of the ranchers and the wives of the tradesmen and the wife of Deputy Taft, a compact, bright-eyed woman named Helen who turned out to be a fierce and practical ally. She spoke to the Caldwell family, who had recently arrived from Kansas with 3 school-age children, and a deep conviction about education that their circumstances had thus far outpaced. She spoke to the Mexican family who ran the farrier operation on the south end of town, whose daughter Maria was 9 years old and already reading English better than most adults in the territory, and who deserved a teacher who would challenge her rather than just confirm what she already knew. She did not speak to Preacher Dunn. She did not speak to Gerald Whitmore. And when word came back that Whitmore had made pointed comments at the general store about the inadvisability of supporting a school run by a woman of questionable reputation who was living under Aaron Kendrick's roof without the sanctity of marriage, Louisa went to Harlow's general store herself and spoke her piece in a clear voice and without any particular heat. She said she was Aaron Kendrick's guest and eventually intended to be more than that. She said her reputation was spotless and the bruise on her face, which by this point had faded to a yellowish shadow, could speak for itself regarding the character of the man who put it there. She said any parent who chose their children's futures over Gerald Whitmore's approval was welcome to attend the organizational meeting she was holding at Helen Taft's house on the following Thursday evening. 11 families came to that meeting. Aaron rode in with her that night and waited at the livery while she ran it, and when she came out 2 hours later with pledges of lumber, donated books, and a commitment from the territorial superintendent's office that Taft had helped her draft by wire, she was electric with it, bright-eyed in the cold November dark. "How did it go?" Aaron asked, handing her Pearl's reins. She told him in the ride home, the words coming fast and warm, and he listened with that careful, complete attention, asking the right questions, and when she finished he said, "You are going to be extraordinary at this." "I already am," she said, with a cheerfulness that was half performance and entirely genuine, and he laughed. It was a good laugh, full and real, and she thought she could listen to that laugh for quite some time. The relationship between Louisa and Aaron deepened through November the way good winter fires deepened, steadily, and with increasing warmth rather than sudden flare. They worked side by side and they talked through evenings and they argued about books with great pleasure and occasional heat, and Aaron finished Bleak House and conceded with admirable grace that he had been wrong about sentiment, and Louisa told him that was the most attractive thing he had said yet, and he had looked at her with that warm, wondering expression that was no longer unnameable. She knew exactly what it was. She felt it too. He had not repeated the proposal. He had said he would not rush her, and he kept his word with a discipline that was, honestly, slightly frustrating, because Louisa's own feelings had been running considerably ahead of her stated position for several weeks now. She lay in the upstairs room under the good quilt and thought about it with the logical part of her mind and the less logical part, and the conclusion they reached together was consistent. It was in the last week of November, on a morning with 4 inches of fresh snow on the ground and ice on the water trough, and the whole world reduced to black and white and blue, that Gerald Whitmore made his final play. He arrived with 3 men this time, not ranch hands but men of a different quality, harder looking and less affiliated with the landscape, the kind of hired men who travel with trouble the way storm clouds travel with lightning. He came to the front door, and this time when Aaron answered it, Whitmore had a folded document in his hand and a very particular kind of confidence. "Kendrick, I have here an affidavit from your neighbor to the south, Henry Purcell, signed and witnessed, stating that he observed Douglas Aldridge's daughter crossing your property line in the hours after midnight 2 months ago in a manner consistent with unlawful trespass. I am also in possession of a statement from 2 residents of this town who are prepared to testify that the woman in question has been residing in your home without marriage or any other legal arrangement, which is in violation of the Territorial Morality Statute of 1876. Aaron looked at the document without touching it. Then he looked at Whitmore. The morality statute of 1876 applies to establishments conducting business, he said, not private homes. Taft has already confirmed that. Taft's confirmation is not legally binding, Whitmore said. Louisa had come to stand in the hall behind Aaron. She could see the hired men in the yard over his shoulder. She could feel the cold air from the open door and also something else, something that was not fear but was adjacent to it. "What is it you want, Whitmore?" Aaron asked. His voice was very quiet and very level. "I want the woman," Whitmore said, and the baldness of it was shocking even coming from a man she already knew was this direct when challenged. "I want her returned to her father's care, which is her legal situation, and I want the matter of her time here quietly concluded." "She is not property," Aaron said. His voice was still quiet, but something had entered it. "Her father is her legal guardian under territorial law," Whitmore said. "She is unmarried and without independent means." "She has independent employment," Aaron said. "She is the contracted teacher of the Cutters Creek School District, which is a formal entity with a territorial charter as of 11 days ago." He paused. "Taft can provide documentation if needed." Whitmore's cold eyes moved past Aaron to Louisa. "I am going to own every acre of land you can see from this porch within 18 months, Kendrick," he said. "Every fence line, every water source, every road into this valley. You want to be on the wrong side of that when it comes." "I am already on the wrong side of it by your measure," Aaron said, "and I find I do not mind." Whitmore stood for another moment, and in that moment Louisa saw something in his face shift from cold authority to something that looked almost like respect, though it was the kind of respect a man like Whitmore carried the way a knife carries an edge, as a means rather than a virtue. He folded the document and put it back in his coat. "This is not finished," he said. "It is finished for today," Aaron said. "Good morning." He closed the door. He stood with one hand on the door frame and his forehead briefly lowered and his eyes closed, and then he straightened and turned, and Louisa was 2 feet away from him. She crossed the 2 feet. She put her hands on either side of his face and looked at him directly, this serious, decent, steady man who had stood between her and every hard thing for 2 months now, and she said, "Aaron." "Yes," he said very quietly. "I am finished deliberating," she said. He looked at her with both the seriousness and the warmth and everything else she had been learning the shape of. "Are you certain?" "I am certain about very little in this world," she said. "But I am certain about this." She searched his face. "Ask me again properly." Aaron Kendrick took a breath. He took her hands from his face and held them both in his, and he looked at her in the gray-white November light of the hallway with the snow outside and the horses in the barn and the land stretching all around them, and he said, "Louisa Aldridge, I want to give you a roof that is yours and a name that is yours and a life that is built with you rather than for you. I want to argue about books with you for 30 years. I want to watch you build that school and everything that comes after it. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "absolutely yes." He brought her hands to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles, and then he looked up at her, and the warmth in his face was so complete and unguarded that she felt it like sunlight on cold skin. "I do not have a ring," he said with a rueful self-awareness. "I do not need a ring to mean what I said," she told him. "You will have one," he said. "Give me a week." She gave him 4 days. It was not that he was slower than promised. It was that on the 4th day he came home with something small wrapped in a piece of cloth, and set it on the kitchen table in front of her while she was grading the first round of arithmetic papers from her students, and she unwrapped it and found a simple gold band with a small garnet set in a plain bezel setting, the stone the color of autumn leaves. "It was my mother's," Aaron said. He was standing at a slight remove, very still, as though the moment were made of something fragile. "She left it to me with the specific instruction that I give it to a woman worth giving it to. I have been keeping it in the desk for 4 years. He paused. "If you would rather have something new and chosen for yourself, I understand." Louisa looked at the ring in her palm for a long moment. She thought of the photograph on the dresser upstairs, the round-faced woman with the attending eyes. She thought of what it meant that he had kept this for 4 years and found her in a hayloft. "This is exactly right," she said. He slid it onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her, which she took as a sign from the mother of the man she loved. The wedding was on the second Saturday of December 1878, in the church that needed a new roof. Reverend Clayton, who was a considerably better human being than Preacher Dunn, performed the ceremony before roughly 30 residents of Cutter's Creek who had, over the preceding weeks, voted with their feet by sending their children to school, pledging lumber, and making it clearly known that their sympathies lay not with the man in the expensive coat, but with the teacher and the rancher who had decided to build something together. Louisa wore the best dress she owned, a deep blue wool that had survived the carpetbag in reasonable condition, and Helen Taft pinned holly in her hair because it was December, and because holly was what was available and because it suited her. Aaron wore his good black coat and a string tie, and stood at the front of that drafty church with an expression that was somewhere between deeply serious and entirely radiant. Deputy Taft gave the bride away, because she had asked him to, and he did it with a gruffness that could not quite hide his fondness for both of them. The congregation in the worn pews was small and real and warm in the way that genuine community is warm, which is from the inside rather than the outside. When Reverend Clayton pronounced them married and Aaron kissed her in that careful, entirely committed way he did everything, the small congregation made a great deal more noise than 30 people should reasonably have been able to make. And Cal Prout, who had brought a fiddle, struck up a reel that was perhaps not ecclesiastically appropriate, but was exactly right in every other way. Gerald Whitmore did not come to the wedding. He sent no correspondence and made no further trouble in the immediate weeks following, which Deputy Taft said was more telling than anything else. The kind of silence that meant a man was rethinking his position rather than redoubling it. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was cold and long and entirely theirs. They settled into the house with the easy competence of two people who had already, in those 2 months before the wedding, learned each other's rhythms. Aaron rose before dawn and came in from the barn as she was building the morning fire, and they drank coffee in the kitchen in the blue pre-dawn light and talked about the day ahead. And there was something in those morning conversations that Louisa carried through the day like a warm coal in a coat pocket. The school opened in January in a converted storage room behind the church, heated by a cast iron stove that Aaron had sourced from the fort at Laramie, with 15 students on the first day and 19 by the end of the first week. Louisa taught from 8 until 2 and came home with chalk dust on her hands, and the particular charged energy of someone doing exactly what they are meant to do. Aaron listened to her in the evenings with the same complete attention he brought to everything, and he had opinions about pedagogy that were better than she expected and worse than she teased him about, and they argued and agreed in equal measure. In February, a letter came from Louisa Aldridge. It arrived at the Cutter's Creek post and was addressed to Louisa Kendrick, which meant her father had heard of the marriage. She sat at the kitchen table and held it for a while before she opened it. Aaron sat across from her and did not tell her what to do. The letter was short and not adequately remorseful, and tried harder to explain than to apologize, which was characteristic of her father. But at the end of it he said, in his careful, insufficient way, that he had left Whitmore's employ in October and was working for a cattle operation outside of Laramie, and that he hoped she was well, and that if she found it in herself to write back he would be grateful. She did write back eventually. She wrote a letter that was honest and not warm and not cold either, that said she was well and married and teaching, and that she would need time. She sealed it and gave it to Aaron to post without explaining all of it, and he posted it without asking, because he understood the shape of that particular silence. It was in March that Whitmore's land survey claim moved through the Territorial Land Office and was formally assessed by an independent surveyor who found no irregularities with Aaron's title, and the claim was dismissed. Whitmore lodged an appeal that was subsequently dismissed as well. After that, the name Gerald Whitmore appeared less frequently in the affairs of Cutter's Creek, and by spring, it was understood by most of the valley that he was directing his attentions and his pressure toward the counties to the north where he had new investments and less history. The north fence line, Aaron told Louisa on the evening he received word of the survey dismissal, was going to need significant work in the spring thaw. "Then we will do it in the spring thaw," Louisa said. "I like how you say we," he told her. "Get used to it," she said. Spring came to the Wyoming high plains with the usual combination of glory and violence, mud and bloom, the mountains losing their white caps slowly, and the creek running full and cold, and the air smelling of everything coming back to life. The school expanded its hours when the days grew long enough, and Louisa began preparing her older students for the standardized assessment that would allow them to receive official territorial certification of their schooling, something that could mean the difference between limited local options and broader possibilities. Maria Caldwell, now 10, was reading at a level that made Louisa begin writing carefully worded letters to the teacher's college in Laramie about scholarship possibilities. The Gutierrez girl, Maria from the Ferrier family, had advanced in arithmetic to a level that filled Louisa with the particular joy that comes from watching a child discover what they are capable of. She was happy. This was not a complicated observation or a provisional one. She was happy in the bone-deep, ordinary way that does not make speeches about itself, but simply lives in the shape of the days and the evenings and the mornings and the long Wyoming nights under the quilts with the sound of her husband breathing beside her. In the early summer of 1879, she knew she was pregnant. She sat with that knowledge for a few days, holding it carefully the way you hold something you know will change everything and are not yet ready to share the change. She told Aaron on a Tuesday evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the late light on the mountains. He sat very still for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand and held it on his knee and looked at the mountains with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something entirely unguarded and enormous. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "I am wonderful," she said. He turned to look at her, and whatever she expected him to say next, what he actually said was, "We are going to need more bookshelves." She laughed so hard she startled the horses in the pasture. The baby came in February of 1880, as Wyoming blizzards raged outside and Helen Taft sat with Louisa through 14 hours of labor, and Aaron wore a path in the kitchen floor, and Cal Prout came and sat with him out of pure solidarity, and because waiting alone was something no man should have to do. The child arrived in the deep of the night, healthy and indignant, with dark hair and lungs that registered a loud and clear opinion about existence. A boy. They named him Thomas Aaron Kendrick. Thomas for the father Aaron had lost when he was 12, and Aaron for the man who had made a home for them both. Aaron held his son for the first time in the dim lamplight of the bedroom with the blizzard howling outside, and Louisa watched her husband's face in that moment, and understood that she was watching a man who had been defined by steadiness and competence discover something that reduced him entirely to the simple, helpless fact of love. "Hello, Thomas," Aaron said softly, to the small, red-faced creature in his arms. "I have been working on your room." "He does not know what a room is," Louisa said, exhausted and smiling. "He will," Aaron said. Thomas was a vocal and curious baby who became a vocal and curious toddler with his mother's auburn hair and his father's serious, attending eyes. He was in the habit of following Aaron around the ranch by the time he could walk steadily, and he had opinions about horses and cattle and fence posts that were largely nonverbal but deeply felt. Louisa taught him his letters at 2.5, which Aaron said was too early, and which Thomas demonstrated was not by reading the word fence off a supply order when he was 3 years old with an expression of great personal satisfaction. The school moved into its permanent building in the spring of 1881. Aaron had organized the build over the preceding winter, coordinating donated labor from 7 ranch families and sourcing lumber at cost through a contact at the fort. The schoolhouse was a single large room with proper windows on both sides for light, a good stove, 12 desks, 2 long bookshelves already beginning to fill, and a bell above the door that rang across the valley on clear mornings with a sound that meant something. On the day it opened, Louisa stood at the front of the room with Thomas on her hip, because there was no one at home to watch him, and she was not about to miss this. And she looked at her students filing into the proper desks in the proper room with the proper light, and she felt something in her chest that had no name in any language she knew, but that was made of everything she had survived and chosen and built. Aaron was at the back of the room, standing with his hat in his hands, watching her. When she caught his eye, he gave her that look, the one that had started as something unnameable in a barn at 2 in the morning, and was now as familiar and essential to her as the mountains through the window. She smiled at him, full and real. He smiled back. They had a second child in 1883, a girl this time, whom they named Clara May Kendrick. May for the month she arrived, and Clara because Louisa had loved that name since she was a child herself, and had saved it without knowing for whom. Clara arrived in the world with a quieter temperament than her brother, but an attention that was, if anything, more focused, and she had her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, and a way of looking at things that made you feel examined and found acceptable. Louisa Aldridge came to Cutter's Creek for the first time in the autumn of 1883, when Clara was 6 months old. The visit had been agreed upon through a careful exchange of letters over 2 years, each one slightly warmer than the last, because Louisa had made her peace with her father, not because he had fully earned it, but because she understood by now that unforgiveness was a weight she carried alone, and she was done with unnecessary weight. He arrived by stage, older and smaller looking than she remembered, and stood in her yard looking at the house and the barn and the school visible in the middle distance, and the mountains beyond, with an expression that contained a complicated mixture of remorse and pride that Louisa felt unequal to the task of fully sorting. Aaron shook Douglas's hand with a courtesy that was genuine if not warm, and that was more than Douglas had earned, and both men knew it. Thomas, who was 3, took to his grandfather with the fearless social confidence of a child who has been loved well, and therefore meets strangers as probable allies. Clara regarded Douglas from her mother's arms with the focused attention that was becoming her signature. The visit lasted 4 days. It was awkward in parts and better in others. Douglas held Clara and told her she had her mother's eyes, and Louisa watched her father holding her daughter and felt something complex and bittersweet, and ultimately not bitter. He was a man who had made bad choices and was now living in their long shadow, and she had learned in the 5 years since that hayloft that what you built going forward mattered more than what was left in ruins behind you. He left on the southbound stage on the 5th morning. He hugged her at the stage office and she let him, and he said, "You found a good man." "I found him," she said. "Or he found me, depending on how you reckon it." "You always were stubborn about who gets the credit," Douglas said, with a sad, fond smile. "I know exactly where I got that from," she told him. After he left, Aaron came and stood beside her on the board sidewalk in front of the stage office, and she leaned into his side without ceremony, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the autumn sun watching the stage roll south. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "and then he will not come again, not for a long time, but I think knowing he could was what mattered." "I think you are right," Aaron said. Life in Cutter's Creek continued to change around them as the 1880s moved forward. The way life on the frontier was always changing, not always gently. The cattle business expanded and contracted with the markets. The railroad came within 20 miles in 1882, which changed the economics of almost everything. New families arrived, some stayed, some moved on. The problems of the territory were not small. The displacement of the Shoshone and Arapaho peoples whose lands these had been. A history of violence and forced removal that sat in the landscape like something unhealed, and which Louisa taught her older students to reckon with honestly because She believed education that ignored injustice was not education at all. Aaron supported this with the straightforward conviction of a man who believed in plain truth even when it was uncomfortable. She taught her students to read the newspaper and argue about it. She taught them mathematics not as abstraction, but as the arithmetic of real life, of land and water and cattle and trade. She taught them history and geography, and the terrible, necessary understanding that the world was large and the valley was small, and both things could be true at once. She watched them grow and leave, and some of them came back and some did not, and either way she had given them what she could, and that was enough. Thomas grew tall and serious and horse-mad in the way that was clearly inherited, and by the time he was 7, he was useful on the ranch in the specific way that children who pay attention become useful earlier than anyone expects. Clara at 4 was already reading with the focused determination of someone who understood that books were a form of power, and Louisa recognized herself in that and took extraordinary satisfaction from it. In the spring of 1885, on the evening of their 7th wedding anniversary, Aaron and Louisa sat on the porch after the children were asleep and watched the late Wyoming light move across the mountains, the sky going from gold to rose to the deep, clear blue that preceded the dark. The horses moved in the pasture. The school bell was visible in the middle distance, a small dark shape against the fading sky. 7 years, Aaron said. From the hayloft, Louisa said. From the hayloft, he agreed. She looked at him. He was 35 now, the angles of his face a little harder than the young man in the barn had been, with lines at the corners of his eyes that she loved and a gray thread or two in the dark hair at his temples that she also loved. He looked, she thought, exactly like a man who had spent 7 years building something real. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me the morning after, about the room having a lock?" "I remember everything about that morning," Aaron said. "You told me the lock was on the inside," she said. "You made a point of it." "I did," he said. "I think about that sometimes," Louisa said, "when I am trying to explain to myself what you are, that detail. The fact that you thought to say it. I thought about your face," he said simply, "the bruise. I thought about what it would take for a woman to climb into a stranger's hayloft in the middle of the night, and I thought about what she would need to feel in order to stay. And the answer was simple." He looked at her. She would need to know the choice was still hers. Louisa reached across and took his hand and held it. Outside, the last light was leaving the mountains, going from rose to gray to the deep, profound dark that was particular to this country, a darkness that was full rather than empty, the sky coming down and the stars coming up in their thousands. "It has always been my choice," she said, "every day." "I know," he said. "That is why every day still means something." She leaned into his shoulder and they sat in the dark with the stars coming out and the wind in the grass and the small, sleeping sounds of the house behind them where their children were growing in their beds. And Louisa Kendrick, who had climbed into a stranger's hayloft with nothing but a carpetbag and $7 and the grim intention of surviving the night, thought that surviving was the smallest part of what had happened to her. She had arrived. The years continued to move through the valley with the slow, sure rhythm of the seasons. A third child came in 1886, another boy, whom they named James William Kendrick. James for the brother Aaron corresponded with in Ohio, and William, because it was a solid name that had no particular claim on either of them, and therefore felt freely chosen. James arrived with Louisa's red hair, and an easy, laughing temperament that made everyone he encountered feel at once that something good was about to happen. By 1887, the school had grown to 26 students and required a second teacher, and Louisa hired a young woman from Laramie named Patience Graves, who had recently obtained her teaching certificate, and whose energy and methods complemented Louisa's own in ways that were productive and occasionally combative and always excellent. The school was recognized by the Territorial Superintendent's Office as one of the finer rural schools in Wyoming Territory, a fact that Louisa received with satisfaction but without surprise. Thomas at 10 was already helping Aaron with the cattle in a substantive way, and Aaron taught him with the same patient completeness he brought to everything, explaining not just how but why, teaching his son to read the land the way Louisa had taught him to read books, as a text with meaning you had to learn to decode. Clara at 7 was going through books the way summer goes through daylight, constantly and with an appetite that could not be entirely satisfied, and Louisa wrote to the lending library in Cheyenne on her daughter's behalf and established a correspondence that meant a new book arrived on the stage every 6 weeks, addressed to Miss Clara Kendrick, Cutter's Creek, Wyoming Territory. The letter from Ohio came in the late autumn of 1887 from Aaron's brother James. Aaron's sister-in-law Margaret was in declining health, the letter said, and James was managing the farm alone and struggling with it. The letter asked, carefully and without demand, whether there was any possibility of a visit, and whether Aaron had any counsel to offer about the finances of a farm operation facing the compounding costs of illness and shortage. Aaron and Louisa sat with the letter together, because that was how they handled things together, and discussed it as an equal problem belonging to both of them. In the end, Aaron wrote a reply that was both practical and affectionate, offering financial counsel in detail, and saying that a visit would happen come the following spring if the ranch could be arranged. He sent a bank draft for a modest but meaningful amount, which they had, and Louisa added a letter of her own to James's wife, woman to woman, about what it meant to manage difficult circumstances with dignity, and she meant every word of it. Gerald Whitmore had by 1887 sold his Cutter's Creek cattle operation and moved north into Montana Territory, where he remained a large landowner and a man of considerable influence, and by most accounts, the same cold eyes and the same belief that the world owed him compliance. His departure from the valley had been gradual and business-driven, and had nothing to do with Aaron Kendrick or Louisa Aldridge, except in the sense that a man who encounters genuine resistance sometimes simply moves his pressure elsewhere, which is its own kind of outcome. He was gone, and the land he had claimed was sold to a family named Whitfield who ran their cattle with decent management and kept their fences on their side of the lines, and the valley was, by measurable degrees, better for his absence. Deputy Arlo Taft retired in 1886, and he and Helen built a small house on the edge of town, where the roses they planted in the front garden became a local landmark by 1888, the largest rose bushes in Cutter's Creek, which was not saying much given the climate, but which they tended with a stubborn devotion that suited them both. They came to supper at the Kendrick place regularly, and the conversation at that table, Arlo's dry humor and Helen's sharp observations, and Aaron's considered opinions and Louisa's entirely uncompromising convictions, was consistently excellent. On a May morning in 1889, when Wyoming was in the process of moving toward statehood, which would officially happen in July of the following year, and the valley was full of the green of its brief and extravagant spring, Louisa Kendrick stood at the front of her schoolroom and looked at her students, and felt the particular quality of a moment that knows itself to be significant. She had been teaching for 10 years in this valley. She had watched children learn to read who had arrived without a single letter in their possession. She had watched Maria Gutierrez leave for the Teachers' College in Laramie on a scholarship and come back 2 years later to open a second school in the county to the east. She had sent careful, considered young people out into the world with the knowledge that their education was real and earned, and belonged to them in a way that nothing and no one could remove. She had done this in a converted storage room, and then in a proper schoolhouse, and through drought years and hard winters, and the grinding ordinary difficulty of keeping a small institution alive through the variable goodwill of a small community. And she had done it while raising 3 children and running a ranch, and being a wife to the most consistently decent man she had ever known. That afternoon she walked home through the spring air, and found Aaron in the north pasture checking the fence line that had been their recurring preoccupation since the very first day they had worked together. He was digging a post hole and looked up at her approach with that look, steady and warm and entirely present. She walked across the pasture grass to where he stood and kissed him in the middle of the afternoon on a Tuesday in May with the mountains behind him and the sky impossibly blue above, and he dropped the post driver into the hole with a clatter and put both arms around her. "What was that for?" he asked into her hair. 10 years, she said. "From the hayloft," he said. "From the hayloft," she agreed. They stood in the pasture in the spring light, and Louisa thought about the woman who had crawled through a gap in a barn wall with a carpetbag and a bruised cheek and $7, and the pure determination to survive until morning. She felt for her at that distance the way you feel for someone you have known well and left behind, with tenderness and also a quiet awe at the distance between there and here. What she had now was not what that woman had been trying to get to. It was something she had not known how to imagine. A home that was hers in the truest sense, not given or assigned or taken but built with her own hands alongside a man's who met her as an equal, stone by stone and season by season, until it was something that could hold a life, hold 3 lives, hold a future she had not dared to picture in the dark of that hayloft. Aaron pulled back and looked at her, and she looked at him. "The fence post," she said. "Can wait," he said. "It absolutely cannot," she said. "That is the north line. It has been waiting since April." He smiled at her, full and real. "You are right. I usually am," she said. "Hand me the post braces." He handed her the post braces, and they worked the fence line together in the afternoon light, talking and occasionally arguing about the proper depth for a fence post in spring-thawed ground, which was a more involved disagreement than it sounds. And the mountains were steady and enormous beyond them, and the children would be home from school in an hour, and the stove needed lighting for supper, and the north fence line was, post by post, being made right. Everything was made right. Everything was made right. There were more years ahead, good ones and difficult ones, and the kind that are simply quiet and ongoing, which is the texture that most of a life is made of when you are fortunate enough to be living it properly. Thomas would grow into a man who ran the ranch with his father's competence and his mother's insistence on fairness. Clara would eventually leave for the East and come back, would become a woman who combined her mother's convictions with an additional layer of the world she had gathered in her absence. James, the laughing one, would turn out to have an aptitude for the law that surprised everyone except Louisa, who had watched him negotiate every conflict in the schoolyard since he was old enough to have opinions, and who had noted even then that he had both his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was a rare and powerful combination. Aaron would live to see Wyoming become a state, and to see his children grown, and to sit on that porch in the evenings, through 30 more autumns, watching the light on the mountains with the woman who had appeared in his hayloft like a problem that turned out to be his life. He would grow quieter with the years in the way that content people sometimes do, the urgency of proof replaced by the ease of evidence, and he would never once take for granted the fact that she had said yes. Louisa would teach until she was 62, at which point she handed the school over to a former student who had come back credentialed and prepared, and Louisa herself began writing a memoir that was direct and personal, and not always comfortable, and that circulated in handwritten copies for years before it was eventually printed in a small run by a press in Cheyenne, under the title of a phrase she had used to a student once when explaining what education was for. The phrase was this: "The choice is still yours." She would never fully forgive her father, but she would maintain the careful correspondence they had established, because she understood by then that forgiveness was not a single act performed once and filed away, but an ongoing process of choosing how to hold what could not be changed. Douglas Aldridge died in 1894, quietly and in no particular drama, and Louisa received the news by telegram and sat with it for a day and then told Aaron, and he held her while she cried, not for the father she had lost, but for the father she had always needed and had learned to live without. That grief was real and complicated, and she honored it as such. She was fine. She was more than fine. On the last evening of October in the year 1889, 11 years nearly to the day from the night she had crawled through a gap in a barn wall, Louisa Kendrick sat on the porch of the house she had helped build in every way a house can be built, with a cup of tea and a shawl and the children's noise drifting out from inside where Aaron was reading to James before bed. The autumn air smelled of frost and hay and wood smoke, and the stars were out, sharp and numerous, the same stars that had been out that night in 1878 when she had moved through the dark with her carpetbag and her $7 and her absolute refusal to be broken. She looked at the barn. The old barn, still standing, though considerably better maintained now, and expanded with a new attached section that Aaron had built the previous summer. She could see the dark gap in the original wall, the gap she had crawled through, still there because it was on the interior side of the new construction, and there was no practical reason to board it up, and perhaps a sentimental reason not to. She thought of that night, and of the man who had come up the ladder with a lantern and found her and said nothing sharp and nothing unkind and brought her coffee in the morning, as though finding a woman in your hayloft at 2 in the morning was a matter requiring only the most practical response. Inside the house she heard Aaron's voice reading, steady and deep, and then James laughing at something, and then Thomas's voice adding something that made Aaron laugh in return, and Clara saying something sensible from her room that silenced all three of them in the way that Clara's sensible comments tended to do. Louisa closed her eyes and listened to all of it. The porch under her feet and the cold air and the stars and the sound of her family inside the house she lived in, the house that was hers in the truest, fullest, most complete sense of the word. She was arrived. She was entirely arrived. The door opened behind her and Aaron came out, having left the children in various states of settling, and he sat down in the chair beside hers and pulled his coat around him against the October cold and looked out at the land and then at her. "Cold," he said. "Beautiful," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the one with his mother's garnet ring on it, and held it the way he had learned to hold things, completely and without show, and they sat together on the porch in the last light of October and let the night come in. "I was thinking," Aaron said after a while. "Always dangerous," she said. "I was thinking that next spring," he said, "if the timber grant comes through, I want to build that second room onto the east side, properly fitted out, good windows." "For what?" she asked. "For you," he said. "For the writing, you need a room with proper light." She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains, which were dark shapes against a slightly lighter dark, their peaks barely visible in the starlight. "You have been thinking about the memoir," she said. "I have been thinking about the fact that you are writing it at the kitchen table every evening after the children are in bed, and that your back hurts from the kitchen chair," he said. "And that what you are writing deserves a proper room." Louisa squeezed his hand. She looked at the mountains and the stars and the dark shape of the barn and the lamplight coming from the windows of the schoolhouse, still lit because Patience Graves worked late on Fridays when she was preparing the week's materials. "All right," she said. "Build the room." "In the spring," he said. "In the spring," she agreed. And the stars were thick and bright above the Wyoming high plains, and the wind moved through the autumn grass with a sound like a long, satisfied breath, and Louisa and Aaron Kendrick sat together on their porch in the solid, lasting dark, and everything that had brought them here. All of it. The hayloft and the coffee and the bruise and the proposal and the ring and the years and the children and the school and the fence lines and the mountains. All of it was present in the particular weight of their joined hands, which held it all effortlessly, as if it had always been exactly this.